So I have to tell you, I had a chance a couple of weeks ago to see a stand-up comedy act. Now, comedy is fun. It makes us laugh. Sometimes it makes us cry, and sometimes it even teaches us some stuff. Now, there's the smart observational comedy of like a Jerry Seinfeld or an Ellen DeGeneres, where they sometimes find a smile in the way life seems to work. There's the anecdotal comedy, maybe a Jeff Foxworthy or a Chris Rock, where they tell a story that's funny, but you find something unexpected in the end. But there's a place in my heart for the just plain old, silly, slapstick comedy that I loved as a kid. You know, the slapstick comedy wherein the comedian simply makes a fool of themselves. See, when I was a kid, foolish behavior, well, it would always bring a smile to my face. When I was a kid, it was stuff like this. Next slide here, Jose. The arrow through the head for Steve Martin, it worked every time for me. I would watch TV and watch the Comedy of Errors, and for me, it was Lucille Ball and Ethel. You know, they're working in the chocolate factory, but they're not really working, are they? No, they're eating all the chocolates as they come down the conveyor belt. And then, you know, sort of the avant-garde at my time when I grew up was this group called Monty Python, and they had the silly walks of John Cleese, buffoonery. But the classic for a young boy growing up when I was 4 or 5 had to be the Three Stooges. See, some folks loved them, some folks hated them, but at age 4 and 5, I didn't see the Stooges act as foolish behavior done for laughs. See, I saw it as the proper behavioral response to the troubles of my young life. That is, until Mom banned the show from the house and said there will be no more going outside and banging other kids on the head. There will be no more grabbing someone's ears, and there will be no more acting like you're so much smarter than everybody else. 2 + 2 is 3. You could kind of argue that the story of Joseph that Art just read to us from the Old Testament centers on foolish behavior that folks thought would make them look so much smarter than they were. We read that climactic ending to the whole story of Joseph, but do you remember the whole story of Joseph? It plays out like a mini novel, or actually a soap opera when you get down to it, and it stems from foolish behavior on the part of every member of Joseph's family. Joseph, his brothers, and their father Jacob. But in this case, the foolish behavior doesn't lead to a bunch of laughs. In this case, the foolish behavior leads to conflict, to discord, to rivalry, and to big-time trouble. See, we find out that Jacob, the father, loved Joseph more than any of his other children because Joseph was born to him in his old age. In fact, Jacob does something foolish. He gives Joseph a special piece of clothing to show how much he loved him more than the others. A coat of many colors. And the result of that? Jealousy, of course. And then Joseph has this dream about all his brothers bowing down to him. And like any good spoiled son would do, he quickly runs and tells his brothers about his dream, which made them despise him even more. And then he goes and tells his father about this dream. And before you know it, the brothers are out in the field tending the flocks, and Joseph is now the quality control inspector, going out there to check on them. Their anger, their rage, their embarrassment, their feelings of parental rejection move them to violence, a plan to kill Joseph while he's away from his father, which on second thought was maybe too foolish a plan. So they regrouped and decided instead to sell him to some merchants who were heading to Egypt. They would then take the blood of a goat, put it on his coat, and show that coat to Jacob. so he would think Joseph was dead. In Egypt, the merchants sell Joseph into the hands of an Egyptian army officer named Potiphar. And Joseph does well serving Potiphar and moves up to overseer of the house. And then foolish behavior rears its ugly head once again. Potiphar's wife casts longing eyes at Joseph. And when Joseph smartly rejects her advances, she turns the story around and tells them that it was Joseph who tried to accost her. So Joseph gets thrown in prison, where there happened to be Pharaoh's baker and butler in prison. They had foolishly offended Pharaoh. They have some dreams that Joseph interprets, and before you know it, Joseph is interpreting a dream of Pharaoh, a dream that forecasts 7 years of tough times coming, or plenty of good times coming, and then 7 years of bad times, of famine coming. Pharaoh's amazed at Joseph's talents and abilities, and he believes this has all been given to him by the spirit of Joseph's God. So Pharaoh appoints Joseph to be the number 2 man in Egypt. And Joseph smartly administers all the grain reserves and stores them up for the future for Egypt and all the neighboring countries. And then, ironically, after the famine starts, the brothers travel to Egypt in order to buy enough grain to sustain their families. Guess who gets to approve the purchase? Of course, it's Joseph. Now, if that's not some kind of comedy of errors, I don't know what is. The foolish brothers ask for help, but get this. They don't recognize that it's Joseph they're asking. Joseph recognizes all the brothers, but they don't recognize him. I would say it's hilarious. It's a complete comedy. In fact, you can almost hear them now. Hey, Mo. Hey, Larry. Hey, Curly. Put the vase down. Shut up in front of the big guy. Hey, Reuben. Hey, Judah. You get the idea. If this was a slapstick comedy with the Stooges, we'd expect Joseph to come down off of his throne, bang them on the head, grab them by the ears, tell them they were imbeciles, and revel in having the last laugh. But this story isn't about observational comedy. It's not about anecdotal comedy. It isn't even about foolish slapstick comedy. It's about foolish behavior in real life. Do you think Joseph ever laid awake at night thinking about what had happened? You think he ever was there playing the conversation in his head of what he would say to his brothers if he ever ran into them again? What would you have plotted doing all those menial tasks in Potiphar's house? What would you have thought about sitting in prison for doing the right thing, having rejected the advances of another man's wife? Joseph, after all, is a human being with the same emotions that you and I have. If there ever was a moment where Joseph would have been justified for putting the brothers in prison or having them killed, this had to be it. Because that would be the smart thing to do, to show them you can't mess around with the number 2 man in Egypt. You better know who you're talking to, or else someone might think you're a fool. Because the brothers asking Joseph for food to keep them alive after the brothers had tried to kill Joseph, that didn't seem very smart at all. In fact, it seemed pretty foolish. You know, foolish is an unambiguous word. It means lacking in good sense or judgment, unwise, not very smart. So I wonder if people thought Jesus was describing foolish behavior when he told them about the kingdom of God. Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. Was Jesus in the middle of some stand-up comedy routine at the time? Was an arrow through the head coming next? Didn't he know who he was talking to? Because the people in Judea, the Romans, you and I, we know that's not how the real world works. The ethics of human culture dictate what is smart behavior and what is foolish behavior. Treat me bad, I treat you bad. Treat me right, I treat you right. We're all very familiar with the code of living of scratch my back and I'll scratch your back. In fact, sociologists have labeled this kind of behavior reciprocity. In every culture across the globe, it seems to be at the core of human interaction. And isn't that how we do life? Life at work or life at home? The Jones sent you a Christmas card. Well, you better grab one of yours and send it right back to them. You brought me a present. I'm going to be warm and loving this evening. Your neighbor's dog does his business in your yard. You take that business and put it right back in your neighbor's yard. You let him know who he's talking to, because if you don't, you might look like a fool. The simple notion that we ought to be nice to those who are nice to us, and we have no obligation to be nice to those who aren't, seems to permeate every human relationship. One might even say it's the very essence and core of everything the Three Stooges did. To think and behave differently would not only be laughable, it would be downright foolish. I guess by definition, that means Joseph was foolish. In fact, you'd laugh at him, make fun of him, if it didn't make you cry. Joseph looks at the brothers who had deserved punishment and death for what they had done, but instead of killing them, he says, "Come and live with me. I will provide for you. All is forgiven." He kisses them. He cries with them. Foolish behavior? Joseph now says that he sees God's hand was there at every moment of his life, using Joseph and his situation, his context, his influence, his gifts, and his talents for something greater, so he could one day save them from starvation, so he could save them from death. Joseph takes the definition of what is smart and what is foolish and turns it on its head. Perhaps what's smart and foolish isn't so clear and unambiguous after all. Because in life, you never know who you might be talking to. So a few months ago, I had a new guy join me in my regular golf group. And as I've gotten to know him, I found out that he used to be a full-time musician and even got signed to a record label. Pretty successful at that. He was in a 90s band, and he played guitar, and he got to tour Europe. I mean, he lived the dream. Who among us has never fantasized about being a big star on stage with guys and gals hanging on every note that you're playing? So he told me that they used to perform a lot in Santa Barbara, and as a golf guy, when he would drive up there, they would stop and play some golf before they would do the show later that night. And so he and his band partner were heading up there for a show, and they were stopped one day, not too long after they were signed, and they decided to play golf before the show. And at the course, they got paired up with two older middle-aged guys. And so the young guys were quiet at first, but as youth is, right, they could hardly hold back their excitement of being signed. And so they began to tell him, you know, we're musicians, and we got signed to a record deal, and we're going to tour Europe, and, you know, hardly anybody in the music business ever makes it. And so the day went on a little bit more, and after they had talked about themselves for a while, they eventually turned, as everybody does when they play golf, and asked the other two guys, so, what do you do? And one of them said, well, you know, I'm a musician too. Oh, really? Did you, like, ever make a living at it? Did you ever play in a band? And the guy said, well, yeah, years ago I played in a band, but I'm kind of on my own now. He said, well, did you ever get signed by a record company? Did you ever get to tour overseas? And he said, yeah, actually I did. So what band were you in? We know a lot of the old music. Maybe we will have heard of you. He said, well, We called ourselves the Eagles. And that's when the light went on. And that's when they recognized him. And that's when they realized they'd been playing golf with Don Henley, the drummer and the founder of the Eagles. He said to me, he said, boy, talk about feeling so foolish. See, I guess like Joseph Brothers, we don't always know who we're talking to. And as a result, we sometimes get surprised by our own foolish behavior. How many of us have had moments where the light suddenly goes on and we see our foolish behavior for what it really is? Trying to right our own fears, jealousies, insecurities at the expense of someone else. Trying to portray ourselves as more important than someone else. Trying to correct the wrongs of others, or maybe dishing out what we think someone else really deserves. Acting like reciprocity is the true secret to rightly managing our human condition. But our rightness doesn't depend on how we make ourselves look in comparison to someone else. Our rightness depends on God. It depends on Him making us right. And what makes this all kind of funny is that it's only God who can enable our rightness to be foolish, just like He did with Jesus. Biblical understanding has always seen the story of Joseph as a type, a foreshadowing of Jesus. Both were scorned by their own people. Both rightly cared for others and were treated wrongly as a result. Both should have punished those who hurt them, but because of their understanding of God, did not. Their understanding of who they were talking to was reflected in forgiveness and love. And both ultimately saved their people from death. They saved them through what appeared to be foolish behavior. It's the same foolish behavior that saves you and me today. The same foolish behavior that we all participate in. The foolish behavior of the cross. Yeah, Jesus looked so absurdly silly. Silly walking, stumbling to the cross. Pilate lamented the whole comedy of errors that seemed to be taking place that day. The guards made fun of Jesus, scorned him, laughed him, called him a buffoon. And while we know Jesus is 100% God, He's also 100% a human being with all the same emotions that you and I have. If there ever was a moment where Jesus would be justified in a little bit of reciprocity, but Jesus didn't come down off of the cross and bang someone on the head. He didn't come down off the cross and grab somebody by the ears. He didn't tell everyone how important or smart he was. In fact, He willingly took all those kinds of foolish behaviors, the foolish reciprocities of all the people who have ever lived or will live, and crucified them there on the cross. And in doing so, Jesus delivered the grace and mercy of God to them and to you and to me. I guess when you think about it, Pilate, the Jewish leaders, the guards, they didn't know who they were talking to. And sometimes neither do we. Next slide, Jose. And the king will answer them, "Truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers, you did it to me." Folks, the death and resurrection of Jesus not only makes us right with God, it's life-changing. It's life-changing because it changes the way we understand the world and the way that we live. One of the main points of the whole Joseph narrative is to point out that the reconciliation between Joseph and his brothers came at the very hand of God. He says, "It was not you who sent me here, but God." When Joseph is able to do good to those who hated him, when he's able to forgive, when he's able to be merciful, he's letting God work in him and through him. Have you ever thought that your life and your interactions with others have been and continue to be influenced by the very hand of God, shaped by the very cross itself, empowered by the body and blood given and shed for you? When we foolishly turn the other cheek, when we foolishly consider ourselves less important than someone else, when we foolishly throw away the ethics of reciprocity, when we foolishly put a body into the ground and through our words and actions declare that that same body will rise and live again, well then, like Joseph's brothers, we really know who we're talking to and who is talking to us and who is talking through us. Foolish behavior, it hasn't changed much since I was a kid. Hasn't changed much since you were a kid. In fact, I don't think it's changed much at all. As King Solomon so smartly wrote in the book of Proverbs, you just can't separate fools from their foolishness. And isn't that a good thing? Because in the hands of God, foolish behavior, well, it sure does bring a smile. In Jesus' name.